Number one. I think we're all set now. I'm gonna wait for a few of you to come in, comrades, before we can start. Come in, comrades. We want to start. I'm not going to speak to two people here. You must come in. We're about to start the lecture on Inguza Massacre. Hey, my eyes. There are lights everywhere here. We're going to start very soon, comrades. I'm just waiting for a number of you to come in so that we can start. Hey, people are receiving calls here, making noise. Yeah, come in, fighters. Come in. We're going to start. Come in. Let me sort out some of these things here. Let me try something with this phone. Where is the camera? Now you are 12, comrades. You are getting there. I'm going to start right now. Let's do this. Let's do this. Okay. Yeah. Comrades, I think let's start, man, without wasting further time. Let me send my special greetings to the national leadership of the EFF, the provincial leadership of EFF in Eastern Cape in particular, the regional leaders across all 8 regions of the province, the branch leaders of EFF across all wards of the province, and a special greetings to all ground forces of EFF who continue to do the groundwork of the organization to make sure that we've got a sound presence across the province. Now we're going to start, comrades, who are remembering the Inguza Massacre, one of the significant events in the history of rural resistance of apartheid, particularly in the former Transkei. This is the event, comrades, where 12 people died. Other reports say 11 died, other reports say 12 people. It's not a train smash. Where 12 people died in Inguza Hill, in Flagstaff. And a lot of others were injured. About 60 of them were injured. And about 21 of them were arrested on the event. So what we're actually going to be doing here is looking into the history of that event and in the context of the broader rural resistance of apartheid. Not only looking specifically on what actually happened, because that event is just a tip of an iceberg. It's a reflection of the happenings that were taking place, in particular in this side of Transkei, from Bizana to Lusikisiki and Flagstaff. Now, let's start briefly, comrades, with the history of that resistance. Around the early 30s, I think it was 1932, there was a commission which was established by apartheid government that was meant to look into the socio-economic conditions of the people in the reserves. In the reserves, the rural areas in particular were referred to as reserves. What that commission found out, one of its findings was that there was excessive agricultural decay in the reserves. And they attributed that to the fact that black people have got a lot of cattle. They said the problem was that you black people have got a lot of cattle. That is why there's a lot of agricultural decline and a lot of stress to the land. And there's a lot of damage of the land. There was soil erosion and all of those things. Now the apartheid does not say the problem is because we have deprived you land. Because you'll remember that South Africans, ever since apartheid took over, in fact, from as early as 1900s, black South Africans were only owning a tiny fraction of the land. And therefore, it was expected that as people who had already lived through their subsistence agriculture, and as people who believed in farming, the amount of land that was allotted to them by the apartheid government was definitely not going to be able to carry the entire burden of their agricultural needs. So apartheid accused black people of having many cattle and said that was the result, that was the reason there was huge agricultural decay in the reserves. They are not saying it's because we have deprived you of land, which was the actual problem. The problem that was happening there was land deprivation, more than what apartheid government was saying to say as an excuse for them to implement a rehabilitation betterment scheme. They said you people have got a lot of cattle. Now, one of the outcomes of that commission, which was established in the early 30s, was an establishment of a program which was called rehabilitation scheme or betterment scheme. What it sought to do was to reorganize the way black people in the reserves lived. It sought to redemarcate and forcefully remove people from certain places where they stayed to go and sit and stay in the manner in which villages are structured right now. In the past, you'd remember that people had huge pieces of land. Umakhelwanoko would be some serious meters away. But today, the villages now are circled in a manner which is not very different from the townships, which was previously not the case. Now, this is what was happening. The betterment scheme, the government says, there is a lot of stress on the land. There is general decline of agriculture. And we blame this on your people, on your overstocking. Now, they introduced this betterment scheme. The betterment scheme sought to do this other thing. Beside relocating people to different places and allocating certain parts of the land for their conservation, it also introduced what was called cattle culling. This meant that if you have got 200 cattle, for instance, you will have to eat a certain portion of those cattle, or you will have to sell them. Now, one of the areas which were first to oppose in an organized fashion this betterment scheme was Mount Elif, especially under the leadership of Unkosu Jojo, Unhlabat Jojo. And I'm going to take you through that brief story of Mount Elif. Sometime in the early 40s, there was a meeting which was called by a certain chief, Ukaulibaso Jojo, where he sought to introduce the betterment scheme to the people, and there and then people outrightly rejected the betterment scheme, only to come back in another attempt about 4 years later and convene the meeting of the people. Actually, in that meeting, announced that a lot of places had already accepted the betterment scheme, which meant that government of the native affairs was going to proceed with the implementation, especially that side of Mount Elif. And people were not very impressed with this announcement. And they started organizing from there, and then it was 1946. Later on, in 1947, the implementation of betterment scheme, stroke rehabilitation scheme started with implementation in Mount Elif, in a place called Elubaleko. What happened there, people were called to come, bring their cattle, their sheep, their goats. The report said the village had about 1,881 goats and sheep. Is there sheep? Sheep, whatever the word is, English. So the village had a total of 1,881. And after the implementation of this rehabilitation scheme, the village was left with only 500 goats and sheep. What apartheid government did, they instructed people to sell the surplus and to slaughter some of those. And what they actually did, the apartheid farmers came in numbers to buy those cattle, those sheep, at a half price of their usual market price. If the cattle was 1,000, those apartheid farmers came in and bought each for 500 rand. That's what actually happened. This happens in 1947 in Lubaleko in Mount Elif, under the leadership of Ukaulibaso Jojo. He was a big brother to Unkosu Nhlabati Jojo. I will speak about this figure. Is one other very important figure in the rural sense. Unkosu Nhlabati Jojo. Now, they are done with the implementation of this cattle culling process in Lubaleko in Mount Elif. They moved to Brooksneck, the Pepeni Brooksneck area, for the implementation of the program. Now, when they get to Brooksneck and Pepeni, people have already heard about what happened in Lubaleko. People lost their animals and they had to slaughter some, selling some in a very cheap price. Now people started organizing against this. This is in the late 40s. In Brooksneck, only a tiny fraction of people actually complied with the instruction to bring forward their cattle. The result of that was that the magistrate of Mount Elif was not very impressed with what happened and ordered police to go and arrest those people who refused to cooperate. And what actually happened there was that people organized against the police, and there was a clash there, and the police ran away without arresting anyone. That was the beginning of the movement which later became to be known as Ikongo. Ikongo was a grassroots movement which was founded in Mount EFF in the 40s, later to move to Bizana, to Flagstaff and Lusikisiki. The name Ikongo has got different connotations. Some people associated with the Congress. Some associated with there is another account by one of the survivors of Ikongo where he said it had nothing to do with the Congress. People were influenced by what had happened in Congo when Patrice Lumumba was fighting against oppression that side. And it turned out that in one of the gatherings that were organized by these Bantu authorities, one of the white government came in and said, what we are doing here is what Lumumba is doing in Congo, and we have killed him, so you should stop what we are doing. And then people carried the spirit of the resistance that was happening in Congo and named their movement as Ikongo. That's another account associated with the Congress movement, as it was gaining some popularity at the time. It was one of the very popular movements at the time fighting against apartheid. So now this is what happens. The resistance continues. These clashes continue, and the results were that. Remember, I told you about Nkosu Ujojo Gantlaband, who was a younger brother to Kaulibaso. Kaulibaso Jojo, who was seen as by the people as a collaborator with the apartheid government, because he was very instrumental in wanting to persuade people to agree to the colonial rehabilitation scheme. As early as 1942, he convened meeting and they wanted to convince people to accept the rehabilitation scheme. Later on in 1946, he smuggled an apparent agreement amongst the people of Amatlesibe that they had actually accepted the rehabilitation scheme, of which that was not true. So with the rise of the resistance and opposition to the rehabilitation scheme, the people of Amatlesibe also rejected his leadership. I mean, the rejection of tribal leaders, of traditional leaders, is a very common feature in this whole resistance of apartheid, because you'll find that in most instances they were being used against the people. So it's going to be a common feature throughout this presentation. So as case Unkosu Kaulibaso Kajojo was rejected by the people, and they subsequently installed his younger brother Untlabati Kajojo to be the chief of the area of the time, because Unkosu Untlabati Kajojo was with the people in opposition of the rehabilitation scheme of the colonial government. So Nkosu Jojo Untlabati continued to mobilize people to oppose the rehabilitation, and what actually happened was that now, after the people heard about what happened in Bruce Neck, people successfully opposing the implementation of culling that site, the news spread to other areas like Flagstaff, Lusikisiki, Harding, and other parts of the country. And they were inspired by the actions of Brooks Neck, Pepeni, residents who were mobilized by the Congo forces. One of the key figures in apart from Nkosu Ntlabati Kajojo was Umpongo Jonas, who was the chairperson of Congo in that Matlesibeni side. So the news of what happened in Brooks Neck spread throughout, and people started organizing. And then somewhere around early 50s, the apartheid government usually change tactics and move from one tactic to another to ensure that they implement what they wanted. So as early as 1951, I think, they introduced what was called the Bantu Authorities Act. What actually the Act sought to establish was a Bantu administrative system. The people were reorganized into tribal authorities, and they created a scheme of leadership, which at the top had a paramount chief and area chiefs. This act also disbanded what was called Ibunga. You'll remember Ibunga. As from the enactment of this act, it was discontinued. So what actually happened after the enactment of the act, people also rejected it and said, this is another way in which government seeks to dribble past us to implement the rehabilitation scheme that for years we've been fighting to reject. They also rejected the system, and they also rejected it for another reason, which they said apartheid government is actually tribalizing us. It was disturbing the normal progression of rural life and the normal system of cultural authority. It was imposing this system in what apartheid had called indirect rule. What they actually wanted to do, there was to they gave chiefs excessive power so that they could use them to influence the people to agree to the betterment scheme. Betterment scheme and rehabilitation scheme is the same thing. You will not be confused. I hope I'm not going to confuse you, because I use these words interchangeably quite a lot. Betterment scheme and rehabilitation scheme is the same thing. So people stood and rejected the tribal authorities system, which was being introduced by the Bantu Authorities Act. Now, this is another thing which was expected out of the chiefs as a result of this reorganized manner of administration of tribal affairs. The chiefs, according to the act, they were expected to forcefully enforce the rehabilitation scheme. That was one of their major responsibilities. This, of course, put them squarely against the will of the people, because people had for years stood in opposition, and they were very unequivocal about it, that they do not want the rehabilitation scheme. So now government came with some tactics, and they gave excessive powers to traditional authorities, and hoped to use them against the people. And of course, some of these traditional leaders actually actively participated in sabotaging the people, in actually aiding the government to implement the rehabilitation scheme. Some of the chiefs were even killed during that time, because people were very intolerant of the people who sold it out and sold them against the apartheid government. So after this resistance, there were other attempts by the magistrates of the areas, different areas, to meet with the communities, try to explain the rehabilitation scheme and its purpose, with the hope that people are actually going to buy in and accept. There was no way that people were going to agree to reduction of their livestock. There was no way that people were going to agree to a destruction of their own form of subsistence living. But the attempts continued anyway. This is in the early 50s. So what also happened was that, like I've said, that the resistance in Mount Olive also inspired other areas. From as early as 1952, a magistrate attempted to remove. Now we get to the actual history of the of the resistance in the Mpondo land outside Emaxesibeni. Remember, I said people were organizing against two major apartheid programs, which was the rehabilitation scheme, which sought to cut their number of stock, and they were fighting against the Bantu Authorities Act. That is what they were fighting against. In the memorandum that the members of Ikongo and Bizana, there's also an indication that they also vehemently opposed Bantu education. But in the main, they opposed the rehabilitation scheme and subsequently the enactment of the Bantu Authorities Act, which sought to reorganize, which sought to give excessive powers to chiefs and sought to use the chiefs against the people to try to implement the betterment scheme. So these meetings by the area magistrates continued, where they attempted to convince people to accept the betterment scheme. From as early as 1942, there was a meeting in Lambas El-Sigisig, one of the magistrate of the area. They tried to convince people to accept the betterment. They argued that it was not as bad as people conceive of it. Now, in that meeting, Unkosu Botasgao was there, accompanying the magistrate, where he tried to persuade the people to accept this. And people from as early as 1952 in Lambas El-Sigisig rejected this proposal. It is also important to note, comrades, that in that meeting, Botasgao, one of the chiefs, the paramount chiefs of the time of the Mpondo people, this eastern side of Amampondo, in that meeting, he actively praised the rehabilitation scheme and wanted to persuade people to accept it. And unfortunately, rightfully so, people rejected the betterment scheme. One of the activists, the community activists of the time, his name is called Mnyungula Maqutu. Mnyungula Maqutu. Kutwa ngesingesilephat kutwa yaphakama inkunzi yaya ngasesihlalweni sikaBotasgao ne-magistrate, yafika xa iphambi kwabo yahlisa isigaga sayo, yabadunusela ngempundu straight, yagqibe yabetha phansi ngeqakade, yathi apha akho umntu uthatha umhlaba wethu. And later Maqutu and Umnqengo Phikani, one of the activists, community activists, were arrested for and charged for disrespecting Botasgao and the magistrate. And then later, in 1957, there was also another attempt. Remember, I said the authorities of the time still continued attempting to convince the people to accept the scheme. Now, in 1957, the magistrate was in Bizana. He was called R.A. Midgley. Also held a meeting, a community meeting, to explain the rehabilitation scheme, with hope that he was going to get a buy-in of the people. And also, in that meeting in Bizana, Botasgao was also there. And people stopped the magistrate while he's still speaking and said, hey, wait, we've heard this from your predecessors. And there is no amount of sweet tonguing as that is going to change the fact that we reject this betterment scheme, we reject the Bantu Authorities Act. We do not want Bantu authorities because these chiefs that we are giving now have been very active in collaborating with you against the will of the people. So people rejected the attempt by the magistrate of Bizana of the time, R.A. Midgley, and said, go back to wherever you came from. We do not want this. And the meeting degenerated into chaos, and we were told that Botasgao there had to escape because the people wanted him in that meeting. That's how much people had grown to resent the tribal authority because they felt that these people are no longer serving us. They serve the apartheid government because they were being incentivized. There was even a call made by the apartheid government to incentivize the chiefs where the Pentament scheme was accepted. Government gave them more plots of land and all of that for having convinced people to accept the betterment scheme, the rehabilitation scheme. So some of the people who were active in convincing the people to accept this nonsense was Unkosu Borders. Now, this is rejected in Bizan in 1957. But despite this opposition to the betterment scheme, to the Bantu authorities system, Upodascout still proceeded and appointed people into the tribal authorities, the councillors. Remember, these tribal authorities are opposed by the people. People do not want them. They are saying this is another manner in which government seeks to enforce this rehabilitation scheme which we have been opposing. Now, Bottascow, against the will of the people, continues to appoint certain councillors into the positions of tribal authority. That which effectively was putting people at loggerheads against each other. That was facilitating black-on-black violence. That was facilitating commotion in the communities because people are not going to sit back and not react when some amongst them collaborate with apartheid government in a system which the community oppose. So that was the danger of the move that Bottascow was doing in proceeding to appoint people into tribal authorities, which the people had rejected. But Yena, because he was a paramount chief there at the time, so he was a beneficiary of the system and he was prepared to do whatever it takes to facilitate this nonsense. So the result was that people continued, even now the people decided to reject even tribal authorities. Remember, our people have always been under tribal authority in their own African First Unit out position of the new draconian tribal system which was envisaged by the apartheid system. Now, people ended up rejecting their own Inkundla. You'll remember, as Lalin had our own African customary way of dealing with disputes. For instance, we would meet in Kundleni and discuss and resolve and deal with the minor cases and all of that. Now people rejected that because they could no longer trust these chiefs. That is one of the reasons why people ended up meeting in mountains. Some of the first meetings of Ikongo in Bizana were held in Bizana. They could no longer trust the tribal courts. And then, after rejecting the tribal authority, they proceeded to go and meet in the mountains, and the movement became to be known as Intaba, because people were actually meeting in the mountains. The mountain in our cultural setup has always been regarded as one of the most pure and spiritually superior places where people go for spiritual cultural guidance, to appeal to Mvelingang, to stop imbalela, for instance, to give them rain and all of that. So when tribal authorities could no longer be trusted, people resorted to those sacred places, the mountains. Now, this is in Bizana. The organization started to discuss this rehabilitation scheme. They've already heard what happened in Mount Olive, and a branch of Ikongo was launched in Bizana during this time. And they continued to meet in the mountain. And After some time, because they heard that there were apartheid informants among, they shifted from Kuntabakanungulan and went to Ndlovu. And also because Ndlovu was convenient in the sense that it was somewhat a center of Imbizana. People continued to meet there. And it is around this time that communication between Flagstaff and Bizana and Lusikisiki started, and an organized kind of resistance which spanned from Lusikisiki to Bizana began to be engineered during that time. And the organizers of Ikongo or the mountain movement in Bizana actively activated this cooperation between these towns. Now, the results were that the communication continued, and the delegation was sent between Flagstaff, Lusikisiki, Bizana, and Jalonjalo, and there was a constant communication about the approach that they need to collectively take in fighting against these Bantu authorities and the rehabilitation scheme. About 1960, early 1960, there was also another attempt in Lusikisiki in Lambas, where the magistrate also convened another meeting and tried to convince people to accept the rehabilitation scheme, but people still rejected. And after that meeting, things degenerated into serious chaos, and some people, some chiefs lost their lives after that meeting because people felt like they were being betrayed by certain people amongst them, especially those in tribal authorities. So the meeting degenerated into that chaos, and there was no resolution. And then the communication between Lusikisiki, Flagstaff, Bizana continued, and with the result that there was even a formation of what was called a defense fund. All the members of the Intahaba or Congo movement, they were contributing a certain shilling to the defense fund for the purpose of funding their own revolution and helping those who get arrested for fighting for the cause of the people, because there was a lot of arrests during that time. So they came up with a fund, a defense fund, charging every citizen around 1 shilling. So one of the very key figures of the Congo in Bizana was Umbamban Solomon Gamadigizel, who acted as spokesperson most of the times in those meetings. Lusikisiki nase Flagstaff, it was Elijah Lande, no Wana Johnson. Later Wana Johnson passed on during the confrontation in Inguza Hill. So this organization now is in Lusikisiki, in Flagstaff and Bizana. They keep constant communication, and they are opposing the rehabilitation scheme and the Bantu Authorities Act. Now, around in 6th June, away from today, a group of about 200 people gathered in Inguza to discuss further their opposition to the Bantu Authorities Act and the rehabilitation scheme. And they were not armed. They were not in a toy, for instance. It was just a meeting of Amampondo and Tabena Senguza as discussed their approach in their continued opposition of the rehabilitation scheme and the Bantu authorities. And while they were still there, a group of apartheid police surrounded them, and a helicopter came and dropped air bombs. And the result was that 12 died on the spot, and 21 of them were arrested, and the 19 of which were sentenced between 18 to 21 months. Amongst those who died was one of the key leaders of the movement, Utatuwana Johnson. This is on the 6th of June, Inguza, on the actual day of the death of the people. Now, the results were that after one of the organizers there, Comrade Utatu Elijah Lande, was released after the initial arrest, he became a wanted because they heard that he was very influential in terms of mobilizing and spreading literacy about these apartheid government. So they went after him, but he was able to duck and dive and escape the apartheid arrest, and he eventually, were told that he eventually left the country and fled the country with the help of All African Convention, one of the most critical grassroots movements that were fighting for black people of the time, the All African Convention. One of the most critical figures there was I.B. Tabata. A certain revolutionary was born in Queenstown and was a member of this All African Convention, which was an affiliate of a non-European unity movement, another very key organization at the time that was fighting, that was mobilizing for what you call for non-cooperation with the apartheid instruments, because they believed that if you do not cooperate, if they form Ibunga, you do not cooperate, they form Bantu authorities, you do not cooperate, the apartheid government with its apparatus will actually crumble eventually. So these were one of the organizations. So Utata Elijah Lande was assisted by the All African Convention to escape the country after he was being sought after by the police. And then later, around July, after the massacre, a commission of inquiry was formed to look into the events of June 6th of 1960, and there was a widespread condemnation of what actually happened and what police did. The commission found that, for instance, that the actions of the police were unjustified. But those police, nobody knows what actually happened to them. They were never, they never faced any consequences for what they did to our people in Inguza. So the commission came back with findings later in the year, and the people rejected them, with the result that the apartheid was not prepared to accept the defeat by Amambondo. It reinforced, there were thousands of police that were brought here just to make sure that it squeezed the ability of the Ikongo movement or mountain movement to mobilize against the apartheid. After those reinforcements, around November, a state of emergency was declared. In the process, about 5,000 people were arrested. State of emergency was declared in the entire Transkei, and about 5,000 people were arrested, and 31 of which were sentenced to life imprisonment as a result of their opposition to the rehabilitation scheme, as a result of fighting basically for their land. Because the rehabilitation scheme sought to disorganize people and take them away from take them away from their land and reorganize them into some tiny plots, just like how villages are designed nowadays. The apartheid government sought to subject people to a kind of a settlement which was not naturally their chosen one. It sought to subject them to a very cruel kind of an arrangement which sought to actually squeeze them out of their bed to land. And it also, another argument another popular argument around this was that apartheid sought to make sure that it kills the ability of the people to self-sustain and live in their own means without subjecting themselves to labor, to the apartheid economy, without having to migrate to go to Johannesburg and Northern Cape and Natal in sugarcane fields. Because apartheid desperately wanted labor, they had to design some of these legislations which were going to force people out of their long-held kind of living and actually abandon their way of living and subject themselves to apartheid labor. That is actually the purpose of these apartheid legislations. They were aimed at making sure that people abandon their way of living and go to seek employment in the apartheid economy. Now, the result was that after the state of emergency was declared around November in Transkei and people got arrested, the movement was disorganized. And that was actually what we can say was the end of the movement in late 1960s. I will pause here, comrades, with hope that you have learned something about this significant event, especially when it comes to the history of rural resistance to apartheid, because most of these events are not well spoken of, especially because they are from the countryside. Around the very same year when people in Bizana gathered to oppose apartheid legislation in March 1960, there was a Sharpeville massacre in Sharpeville. And for Inguza massacre to happen a few months later. But how we commemorate these events, for instance, does not strike a balance, because I think we tend to look more to the events that happened in the urban and in the townships more than what happened in the rural areas. So it's important, comrades, that for us, we must authenticate and bring these events into the national light and give them the respect that they deserve. Because this was one of the most important events in the history of our war against apartheid. As a result, one of the people who wrote and interacted intensely with Amampondo during that time was Tatu Govenberg. And it is said that, actually, he says that what happened and the general organization and the approach of Amampondo towards the fight against apartheid influenced his strategy when he was later instructed to draft the concept document for the Umkhonto Wesizwe. One of influences that went into his drafting of that document, Imaibuyi Africa, came from his interaction with Amampondo and how he had observed their fight against the apartheid. So it is one of very important, very significant events that we must every time pause and reflect and give equal importance, just like all other events that happened everywhere during apartheid, because telling our story of apartheid resistance without telling these stories of rural resistance, that story is not complete. Thank you very much, comrades, for tuning in. Yeah, truly, I also see some of the comrades from the other political organization. I'm happy with that, because we are talking about events that are significant to all of us, regardless of our political lines. So we cannot reject political education on the basis that it comes from a certain political party. That's another attitude we must shy away from. We must get rid of that attitude. Thank you for tuning in. This was a lecture on history of Inguza massacre presented to you by the provincial leadership of EFF in the Eastern Cape. Thank you very much. Have a good night. Before I forget, the organization is also going to demonstrate on Monday against the heightened police brutality against black people across the world, in particular in America and in South Africa. We've seen what recently happened with the killing of Collins Khoza by our military forces. So we're going to be peacefully demonstrating in police stations, in embassies, to call for ceasefire, to call for an end of police brutality, especially against the black people across the world. We are going to do that with strict observation of lockdown rules. There is going to be observation of social distance, of sanitization, and we're not going to be in huge numbers. It's not a mass demonstration. It's just a few comrades who are going to be there to demonstrate, to say we add our voice in the call for the end of police brutality against our black activists. Besides that, I hope that, comrades, wherever you are still adhering to the lockdown rules, because there is an attitude with which we look at this COVID-19 pandemic, and we are reckless in our interactions. We think that this thing does not kill, but numbers are showing us every day. They keep rising and people are dying, literally dying everywhere across the world. But the manner in which we still treat it with a lot of recklessness is quite worrisome. So I hope wherever you are, comrades, you are going to try to stick to those lockdown rules, which are actually meant to protect us and our families. Thank you very much, comrades. Have a good night. EFF loves you.